Hey guys, thanks for joining us tonight. So, if you've been keeping up with the news this last week, you probably heard quite a bit about the British royal family. But if you haven't, then I'll fill you in on what's been going on. So, there was a falling out between the rest of the British royal family and Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. It's all being played out in the press. People are accusing each other of racism, and then they're accusing the others of abusing staff, and it's all there for the world to see. And to be honest, I haven't paid that much attention to the story. I don't really care that much about the royal family. I haven't watched the weddings over the last few years, and I don't really follow the story. But there are a ton of people that do. There are so many people that are infatuated with the royal family. And it's crazy to me, but some people care a whole lot about this family. And I was wondering, why is this? Why do people care so much? And I was thinking about it, and I was like, maybe it's because we've bought into the Disney storyline. We see this royal family, and we're like, I want them to live the fairy tale that I see on the screen. And even then, why do we want them to live a fairy tale? Because it's a little unrealistic, honestly. And I think that's because we want to live vicariously through this family. We see these royals, and we want them to live happily ever after because we see ourselves in that story. We think if they can do it, then maybe we can do it. And that's why it's so intriguing to the world when the royal family comes out as not perfect, when we see the drama, when we see the dark side, the not fairy tale life of the royal family, because it shows that they're not perfect, and the people who viewed them as perfect, who are living vicariously through them, are not perfect either. We're outed as imperfect people right along with them. But like I said, I don't really follow the royal family that much, so it doesn't mean that much to me. But let's bring it a little closer to home. Maybe this will apply to you a little more. Have you heard about the scandal with the Hillsong Church and their pastor? If you haven't heard about it, a few months ago, the lead pastor of Hillsong, and Hillsong is one of these giant mega churches. Okay, it's a huge church. The lead pastor a few months ago was fired because of moral failures. And what exactly the moral failures were isn't really the point. The main thing is what's happening in the aftermath of this scandal. Hillsong Church is really struggling because of what their leader did and is accused of. They're really struggling to cope and to survive even. Or what about this, the Catholic Church? Over the last few years, there have been quite a few accusations of sexual misconduct on the part of some of the leaders in the Catholic Church. And how many people in the church have had their worlds rocked because of these scandals by a few leaders? I think it's hard for us to see leaders and people we look up to fail, because it outs us on one level, and it shows that they're not perfect. We want them to live this fairy tale life, but that's not realistic for them or for us. Our leaders are people, same as you and me. People aren't perfect, and when it comes out that they're in fact not perfect, that they're not living fairy tale lives, when that becomes clear, it catches headlines, and it's painful for people to see. So, 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 6 through 8 is where we're going to start tonight. 1 Samuel 8, 6 through 8. And as you're turning there, I want to give you a little bit of context. So, the period of the judges is coming to an end, and the monarchy is about to begin. And it's a new age for the history of Israel. So, it's 1 Samuel 8, 6 through 8. 1 Samuel 8, 6 through 8. And it says this: When they said, "Give us a king to judge us," Samuel considered their demand wrong, so he prayed to the Lord. But the Lord told him, "Listen to the people and everything that they say to you. They haven't rejected you. They've rejected me as their king. They're doing the same thing to you that they have done to me since the day that I brought them out of Egypt until this day, abandoning me and worshiping other gods." And now we're going to jump down to verse 19. Verse 19. The people refused to listen to Samuel. "No," they said, "we must have a king over us. Then we'll be like all the other nations. Our king will judge us, go out before us, and he will fight our battles." And Samuel listened to all the people's words, and then repeated them to the Lord. Listen to them, the Lord told Samuel. Appoint for them a king. So, Israel has rejected God as their king in favor of a human king. And from a biblical standpoint, the eventual rise of the monarchy was always part of the plan. We see this early on in Scripture in Genesis and Exodus, that a king was down the road, and God himself said it. So it's always been part of the plan. The function of the king was to provide justice and protection for the people and to be a physical representative of the ultimate rule of God over Israel. And the people of Israel saw a permanent monarchy as a more effective way of achieving those goals than what had been happening in the past several hundred years with the judges and having to wait on God to send a new judge to save them from whatever oppressive force was attacking them at the time. So, why would God be upset by the request for a king if it was part of the plan all along? The crime of Israel wasn't their request. It wasn't that they asked for a king. It was their expectation that a human king could succeed where they believed that God had failed in providing for them. They thought a human could do a better job than God. So the first man that was elevated to this lofty position of kingship was Saul. And Saul has often been characterized by jealousy and paranoia, and we could see how that would be the case if we only read the second half of the book of 1 Samuel. If we only read that first half, you'd see all of these glaring character flaws that he has. But Saul wasn't always that way. At the beginning of his rule, Saul is portrayed as a shy, sincere, likable guy. He even rescued a town full of hostages from an oppressive force. He's presented as just the type of guy that you would look at and you would say, I want that guy to be a king. That's a good dude right there. He's that guy. And so what changed from the early days of his rule that caused him to eventually go off the deep end in the second half of 1 Samuel? When Saul became king, Scripture tells us that the Spirit of the Lord came on him and empowered him to perform his duties as king. And we can agree that having the Lord on your side is going to be a pretty big help for you as king. But along the way, Saul makes several mistakes that lead to the Spirit leaving him. And actually, when the Spirit leaves, an evil spirit comes and replaces the Spirit of the Lord and torments Saul. And that's just rough for him. It makes it hard to be a king. Those mistakes that Saul made had a lot to do with his ignorance in regards to the covenant and spiritual things. He was sincere, but he was superficial. And this makes sense because Saul is a product of the Judges period where hardly anybody took the covenant with God seriously. Paul's shortcomings are understandable, and they put him in the same category as the rest of his subjects, kind of spiritually ignorant. But that's the point. That's the point, is that he really was no different than everybody around him. A king is expected to be in a category above everyone else in order to fulfill his duty as the leader of Israel. We want our leaders to be perfect. But Saul never gained the theological sophistication that he needed to see and perform his role effectively. And so ultimately, Saul fails as king, and Israel suffers in many different ways because of his failures. David was the next man up in the monarchy, and Saul was characterized by jealousy and paranoia, like I said a little while ago, and we see him as a villain because of that. And so after him, we have the complete opposite. We have David, and we put him on a pedestal as a spiritual giant. We want to be more like King David. And while it's clear that David has more of a heart for God and for spirituality more generally, we need to be careful that we give a full and accurate picture of David as king, because it wasn't all pretty. The first description of David comes in 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 14. And here Samuel informs Saul that God has rejected him as king for the mistakes that he had made, and that instead of Saul, God has found somebody who is a man after God's own heart. And I've kind of wondered before, what does it mean to be a person after God's own heart? And I think that all we need to do to find the answer is look at David's life and the rest of Scripture. David was a man who had total faith in God. He was a dedicated servant, and he led Israel the best he could towards God. However, even a man after God's own heart can fall from grace. And David's shortcomings didn't come from ignorance like Saul's had. David knows what he's doing. David's weakest moments came from impulsivity, temporary payoff, and neglect of long-term consequences. David's lust led him to commit adultery and then murder to cover it up. David's inability to discipline one of his own sons led to other members of his family being killed. And he had more moments like this. Those weren't the only two. But God still chose David. God still chose David because he repented and because he continued to serve God even in the aftermath of all the mistakes that he made. A balanced view of David recognizes he was an incredibly godly man. But it also makes clear that even David wasn't immune to lapses in judgment like you and me. Despite being a man after God's own heart, David wasn't perfect. David actually failed to be the leader that Israel had asked for, the leader that could do better than God had. And the consequences were far-reaching, long-lasting, and his subjects were caught in the crossfire. People died. People had their lives ruined by the actions of David. And it just goes to show you, look what happens when people reject their holy God for one made of flesh and blood who isn't perfect. So, what's the lesson? What's the takeaway from this? Well, one, in a practical sense, no leader here on earth can ever fill the shoes that God can. Practically, no one has the power that God does. There's only one ruler of the world, only one ruler of the entire universe, and that's God. No leader here on earth can measure up to the power of God. And also, no leader is ever going to care about you the way that God does. God is the ultimate picture of a powerful and benevolent king. Number two, in a spiritual moral sense, no leader can measure up to God. It's okay to admire people on earth, our leaders, and even emulate them. But when we elevate them to a pedestal that is equal to or greater than God, they're going to ultimately fail us. God is a force for righteousness, unlike anything that you and I will ever see here on earth and that any leader will ever be able to measure up to. And third, we need to avoid putting people on a level playing field with God. This causes us to have a warped view of both God and our leaders, which is unfair to both of them. We bring our leaders way too high to a level that they can't possibly live up to, and we bring God down to our level, and it's not fair to either. We don't say things like our leader is equivalent to God. We recognize that God is so much more powerful, so much more righteous than anybody here on earth. But what do our actions say that our words don't? Who do we listen to? Who do we hang on their every word? Who do you respect? Who do you give your time and your money and your attention to? Who do you follow? Who do you look up to? Because there is only one person worthy of our time, our respect, our attention, and our love and our worship, and that's God. One last note. This lesson has been more solemn and more serious, but something really exciting actually happens in David's story. See, God excels at using flawed, broken people to accomplish his purposes, to do incredible things. And in spite of his flaws, God makes a promise to David, and it's in 2 Samuel chapter 7. 2 Samuel chapter 7. And here's the scripture. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and appointed you ruler over the people of Israel. I've been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all of your enemies from before you. Now I'll make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth, and I will provide a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they have a home of their own and no longer will be disturbed. Wicked people won't oppress them anymore, as they did at the beginning and have done ever since the time that I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also give you rest from all your enemies. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up for you offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with the rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. And so the thing that I want y'all to take away from this little bit of scripture is that as Israel and its leaders ride the spiritual roller coaster, God is at work. Jesus is on the way. And so for us, as we ride the spiritual roller coaster that our world can put us through sometimes, and same for our leaders, as our leaders disappoint us, as we realize that this world is a broken, flawed place that desperately needs God, we can remember that God is actively at work. He hasn't abandoned us to the chaos. God is at work. He has a plan, and he's here with you and me.